We're talking today with John Colburn of Portage, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, John, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Born in Detroit, Michigan in February 18th, 1942.
Okay.
Lived in Detroit until I was in 6th grade, moved to the suburbs of Detroit.
Okay, and what did your family do for a living when you were growing up?
My dad and my grandfather were both engineers. Grandmothers were housewives.
Okay, and so was your father doing engineering work during World War II, or was he in the service? Or?
He was doing engineering work, so he did not go into the military.
Okay, all right. And what high school did you go to?
Bloomfield Hills High School in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan.
Okay, and when did you graduate?
1960.
Okay, and what did you do once you got out of high school?
Okay, that's where the Army career starts.
Okay.
Enrolled in Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, although I'd never been to Kalamazoo, because I wanted to be a teacher, and that was reportedly a good place to go become a teacher. And I remember I was 18 years old, going to registration as a freshman in the gym, and one of the decisions I had to make was, did I want to take ROTC or Phys-Ed? And I remember my thought was, well, I came here to learn new things. I've taken Phys-Ed in high school, so I took ROTC. Changed my life. And I'm still part of the ROTC Department Alumni Association. That was just one of those decisions you make as an 18-year-old, and boy, did it have big effects.
Okay, explain how the ROTC program actually worked at Western and what you did.
The ROTC program was interesting. You had to take either ROTC or Phys-Ed, one or the other. And so a lot of people took ROTC, all men, of course. Women weren't allowed. And we had somewhere during my 4 years in the ballpark of 700 or 800 cadets. Right now, the department is a large ROTC department and an excellent one, and they have about 160 cadets. The head cadet now is a cadet battalion commander. My senior year, I was a cadet battalion commander. I was one of 5 cadet battalion commanders, and we had a cadet brigade commander. So I did very well. I stayed all 4 years. I got contracted for the last 2 years, which means we got paid $1 a day, $30 a month, which seems kind of funny now. And at the end of 4 years, I was a cadet battalion commander, and I did not graduate because I still had my student teaching to do.
Okay. Now, just to back up a little bit, what did the ROTC training actually consist of? What were you doing?
Every week we met for drill and ceremonies, which was one afternoon, and we actually went out with this huge crowd of cadets and marched and drilled and did all kinds of things. And we had classes, and the classes were a whole range of things to prepare us for summer camp after our junior year. I went to Fort Riley, Kansas, and then to prepare us for becoming lieutenants when we graduated and got commissioned.
Okay, so what did you do at Fort Riley?
Sweated a lot. Fort Riley has, you picture canvas as being flat, and that's because God pushed all the hills into what is now Fort Riley, and we ran up and down most of them. It was brutally hot, and we were there for 6 weeks. It was difficult, it was hard, it was supposed to be a lot of physical training, a lot of running, rifle ranges, machine gun ranges, bazookas, all kinds of fun stuff. And it was intense, difficult land navigation. Getting from here to somewhere with a compass. Good luck on that. That was a hard part, and one of the really required, enumerated, measured things that you had to pass. And we finally got done with that and went back to our senior year.
Okay. Now, if you do 4 years of ROTC, are you now expected to take a commission and go into the military, or do you have options at that point?
Assuming that you fulfill all of the requirements, like graduating from college is one of the important ones, then you will be commissioned as a lieutenant. Undoubtedly in the Army, there's a few weird examples of people getting to some other service, but that's really not one of the typical things.
But you were doing Army ROTC specifically anyway, so
Yeah,
that would be where you would go.
Western there is Army ROTC, and so you get commissioned either in the National Guard, the Army Reserve, or active duty. And at the time I graduated in 1964, since Vietnam was starting to build up, and I was a distinguished military graduate and one of the cadet battalion commanders and all that, so I got my first choice of branch, and I was put on active duty.
Okay. Now, you'd mentioned before that you didn't actually finish because you didn't have your student teaching.
Yep.
Did you still have a bachelor's degree at that point, but just not the certification, or how did that work?
No, my graduation was after a semester later in January '65. So.
Okay.
The problem came during that semester that I was student teaching. I had to go take an Army physical, and I took it and I failed it for reasons that seemed pretty thin to me. And so all right, rats, okay, that ends that. But then about a year later I said, no, I did this, I did well at it, I really enjoyed it. I want to go in the Army in spite of the fact that everybody was running like mad from the military because of Vietnam. And so I pursued it again and went and took another physical and passed it. Okay, then I took another physical and failed it. And then we came to a compromise that said, all right, this issue we're coming up with here is pretty thin, but it says we have to do this. But what we'll do is we'll put you on active duty, and sometime during your active duty we'll fix the problem that you may or may not have. So that seemed reasonable because the Army really needed lieutenants at that time.
All right.
So on one day in January I graduated from college in January 1965. In the next 3 years, I taught in and around Detroit for 3 years. I got my master's degree, and then I finally worked out that compromise with the Army. And after I taught for 3 years, had my permanent teaching certificate, had my master's degree, and then I went on active duty.
Okay.
Which was interesting. On
Now,
the 1st of February, 1968.
All right. Okay. Now, talk a little bit about the time. Were you in the city of Detroit or in the suburbs, or?
I taught in a little town. Because I graduated in January, it was interesting to try to find a teaching job in the middle of the school year.
Right.
I finished my exams on a Friday in January, graduated on Saturday, moved back to my mom and dad's house in Bloomfield Hills on Sunday, and started teaching in Ortonville on Monday morning. So my day off was my day to move back home, and started back on Monday and taught in Ortonville, which is a little bedroom community between Detroit and Flint, between Pontiac and Flint, and taught there one semester, taught elementary school science, which was really what I wanted to do. I mean, I not only found a job, I found a job teaching what I wanted. So I taught 5th and 6th grade science, which was really neat. But Ortonville was obviously a dead-end place. So after that semester, I went to Farmington, which is a suburb of Detroit, growing like mad at the time, and taught there for 2 years. And then knowing that I was going on active duty, the riots happened in Detroit that summer of '67. And so I went into the Detroit school board office and said, I want to teach in Detroit. And they were looking for anybody who could walk and breathe to be a teacher. And when I said, well, I'm a certified teacher, I have my permanent teaching certificate, I have my master's degree in elementary education, and they looked at me like, you got to be crazy, what are you doing? And I said, no, this is my home, this is where I'm from, I want to come and do this until I go in the Army. And they said, okay, fine. So I taught at Goldberg Elementary School down on 2nd Street in Detroit for that one semester before I left to go on active duty.
Okay. Did you see yourself anything relating to the riots or the consequences of the riots or anything like that?
Oh, heavens, yes. We lived at the corner of 8 Mile and Southfield in Detroit. Watched the Army convoys and the National Guard convoys going down Southfield to go downtown. I was still finishing my master's degree at Wayne, driving across fire hoses to get to Wayne that summer. When I got to Goldberg School to do the prep the week before I started teaching, the parking lot was guarded by National Guard soldiers. Yeah, the riots were very much in effect. And then my kids, I taught, among other things, English, got some really interesting stories from my fifth graders about where they went when the bullets started flying. And difficult, interesting time to be there.
All right. Now, you mentioned before that you were determined to go into the Army, even though the whole Vietnam thing was going on. And how much did you know about Vietnam, what was going on over there, by the time you actually went on active duty?
Not much, like most people, and like the people who were protesting about it, who were clueless. And so I went, because I felt I owed it to the country and to the Army to do this, so okay. I went.
Now, when you go in, do you get additional training now that you go in? Do they send you off for lieutenant training and that kind of thing?
Yeah, you're already a lieutenant. Mm-hmm. You're already commissioned, so you go as a commissioned officer, and the first thing you do as a lieutenant, go to school. Mm-hmm. And at that time, it's changed now, but at that time your school had to do with your branch that you were assigned to. I was assigned to Transportation Corps. So I went to Fort Eustis, Virginia on the 1st of February, 1968, and went to TOBC, Transportation Officer Basic Course 668, which was 9 weeks long. We graduated from that the day after Martin Luther King was killed. The morning we were going to graduation, we picked up the newspapers, and there were the headlines about that tragedy. But those weeks at Fort Eustis, learning how to be not now an officer, we already did that, but a Transportation Corps officer, and learning all about our branch and all the aspects of running a truck company or running a boat company. And the Army has more boats than the Navy does, and all of that kind of stuff, as well as some of the general things like the Uniform Code of Military Justice and a lot of other Army topics. So at the end of that, graduated from school and went to my first permanent station, which was at Fort Gordon, Georgia.
Okay. And what were you doing there?
3 things, and I was there for 2 years. One of the things we'd been told at TOBC at Fort Eustis was, everybody's going to Vietnam, here's what you ought to do. Sign up for 3 years instead of 2. Spend your first 2 years in Europe as a lieutenant, and you'll learn all kinds of wonderful things. And then the 3rd year, when you go to Vietnam, you'll go as a captain, and we'll make you a company commander, and that'll be great for your Army career, and won't that be good? And about half the guys bought that story. I was not one who did. So I went to Fort Gordon expecting that at the end of the year I was going to go to Vietnam as a lieutenant. And some people, about half of our class, got sent to Vietnam as lieutenants. One of the things we found out later was the reason that they had told us this, the experience had been by 1968 was that the most dangerous lieutenant job in Vietnam was an infantry officer. The second most dangerous was a Transportation Corps officer. And those lieutenants were getting hurt and killed at a rapid rate, and so they doubled the size of the fill of lieutenants into OBC and told us this thing of, go over there as a captain instead of a lieutenant. But the reality was they had a whole lot of lieutenants to select from, so I spent my 2 years at Fort Gordon.
Okay. And your job at Fort Gordon was?
I had 3 jobs, 3 major commands, and the first one was to the Civil Affairs, 95th Civil Affairs Group. And the 95th Civil Affairs Group was worthless. They had nothing to do, and it was a parking lot for lieutenants waiting to go to Vietnam. That would be me. And a few senior officers who were at the end of their military career and were coasting to retirement. So part of the problem with that for the lieutenants was there was no mentor. There was nobody to look up to. There was nobody you could say, I want to be that guy and teach me how to be a good lieutenant. And in ROTC, we used to do D&C, drill and ceremonies. At the 95th Civil Affairs Group, we signed out to D&C, donuts and coffee. one of the contests we lieutenants had in the 95th CA group was how many holes of golf could you play in a work week. And Bill Noonan held that record when he left for Vietnam at 99 holes in a week. It was that kind of unit. And so
how long did you do that?
too long, several months,
Okay.
until I could finally find a place to go. And I found what should have been a great place to go. In 1968, there was basic training at a whole bunch of Army posts because they were building the Army like mad to send people to Vietnam. And we had 2 basic training brigades. I'm a teacher, right? I have a master's degree in that. But 1st Basic Training Brigade had a unit, a company called Army Preparatory Training. It was part of McNamara's 100,000. McNamara's 100,000 was people who did not pass the test to get into the Army, but because Vietnam was building so much and we needed cannon fodder, we took 100,000 of these people and put them into a thing like Army Preparatory Training and tried to teach them enough to become qualified to become soldiers. What we found, and I became part of that unit at the 1st Brigade. It was attached to brigade headquarters because they had to stick it somewhere and they couldn't put it in a regular battalion. And I was the training officer, which was a perfect place for me until the company commander who I went to work for left a month after I got there. And I got another guy who was clueless. He was an E6. The Army also opened up OCS at every branch, and this guy was an infantry staff sergeant who went to infantry OCS and became a lieutenant. So I worked for him, and he was probably a really good E6. He should have stayed being a good E6. But there I was working in this APT thing.
Now, did he get a direct commission as a captain, so he outranked you? Or?
No, he got a commission as a lieutenant from OCS, and then he had done that before I got commissioned.
Okay.
So he was a 1st lieutenant. I was still a 2nd lieutenant, so I worked for him. What we found with these young kids who had not passed the Army test, a lot of them didn't pass the test because they couldn't read at 7th grade. But a lot of them couldn't read English at 7th grade. They were really good reading Spanish. So we had some pretty smart kids, but not literate in English, and that was a problem. So we taught them school, high school, in a barracks building upstairs with civilian teachers for half the day, and the drill sergeants taught them Army for half the day. And when they finished our program, then we sent them off to a regular basic training company. And they had a leg up because they had already done a lot of basic training with our drill sergeants. So there was some success for some of these kids, and then they went off to Vietnam after basic training in AIT.
Okay. Now, part of the reputation of the whole Project 100,000 is you have people who don't pass the aptitude test, but there was also a suggestion or the impression of people who were in Vietnam that a lot of these people were social misfits or people who shouldn't have been in the military at all. And did you see any of that?
That's absolutely correct. Every morning, this was part of the lack of leadership of our company commander. Every morning we would go in, and the first question was, who do we give an Article 15 to this morning? Because there had been fights, there had been whatever problem had come up overnight, and we had to deal with that every morning when we went in. And
so what is an Article 15?
A non-judicial punishment can be given by a company commander, or there's a field grade. Article 15 can be given by a field grade officer, battalion commander, lieutenant colonel, and it's a punishment. It's part of your record. You can lose rank, you can lose pay, you can get stuck in quarters. There's, depending on what the offense is, and there's a limitation of what the punishments are. Company commanders give out less punishment than battalion commanders, so if somebody really did something stupid, in our case, we'd send them to the brigade because we were attached to brigade. So it was a struggle a lot of mornings, and It was an interesting time, and I stayed there for quite a while, and then went over to a regular basic training company, and became the training officer there, and that was a lot easier, more fitting, beneficial, easier to deal with because of the kind of trainees we had, and.
So among the regular trainees, I mean, did they just follow orders better, understand things better, or?
Yeah, and we had National Guard guys who I remember. National Guard guys had the most interesting answer to drill sergeants: call me anything you want, but in 6 months, call me at home. And the drill sergeants smiled and said, "Yep, but I'm going to get you anyway," you know. And they made that 6 months a lot of fun. But they were generally much more amenable to the kind of training, those regular basic trainees, because they were kids who were more adaptable to things and change and could deal with it, and were willing to go along with it, where some of the APT crowd, and enough of them to create animosity and problems and unrest, and so they were much more difficult to deal with.
Okay. Now, what was life in Georgia like more generally at that time? Because you can go off base and that sort of thing, and there's
Sure.
a community out there.
Racist. Again, I'll get to that in a minute. I loved being in Augusta, Georgia. We got there on Masters Weekend, which is a terrible time to show up in Augusta, Georgia. The good news was the Army had a place for us to stay that week when we got there, because there isn't anywhere else you're going to stay anywhere in the area. It's really a nice city. It's at the navigational limit of the Savannah River. It's an hour from Savannah. Right across the Savannah River to Aiken, Georgia, or Aiken, South Carolina, excuse me. Nice city, good place to be. And we lived in an apartment for a while, and then we moved into on-base housing after we'd been there long enough. That was even better.
Yeah, so you were married at this time?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Our first son was born at Fort Gordon in February 1969, and I'll get to my wife and second son in a minute. One of the fascinating parts of being in the basic training company was not only the job of basic trainees and that, but as a lieutenant, you have a job description, and the last line says, "and other duties as assigned." And those were sometimes the most interesting part of the job. So at both those basic training companies, I had a laundry list of other duties as assigned, of being supply officer and mess officer and historian and all kinds of stuff. But one I got, not from our company, but from brigade headquarters, was I got to be the brigade trial counsel. And that's the special court under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The brigade had a special court convened by the brigade commander, and I was the prosecutor. That's what the trial counsel does. And one thing I found was, as the brigade trial counsel, I not only prosecuted the cases, I investigated them. So I would get a charge sheet that says Joe Snuffy disobeyed the order of an NCO and of a commissioned officer and was AWOL and whatever. And then I got to go investigate all that. And then when it came to trial, I was the one who prosecuted it. It was really a fascinating job. It was really, really interesting. I had a pretty good record. I lost one case in all of the ones that I tried, and that was a case that I went to the brigade commander and said, I cannot win this. I can't prove this element of the charge, and and he isn't going to admit it on the stand, and I cannot win this. And he said, of course, try it anyway. So I did, and by golly, we lost because we couldn't prove the charge. So it was fascinating. It was really an interesting part-time job.
Okay. Now, would you have cases that you'd investigate and determine that really this shouldn't go to trial at all?
Everything that I got went to trial.
Okay.
I was, one of the things I did that I got people to accept was some kid, some poor basic trainee, this 18-year-old kid from somewhere had never been out of the county he was born in before, and now he's in the Army because he got drafted, and one of the young E5 drill sergeants told him to do something, and the kid says, "I'm not doing that." Usually not that nicely expressed. And so the other drill sergeant says, "Do it," and the kid now has to say, "I'm not doing that." And then the senior drill sergeant and the first sergeant and then the training officer and then the company commander, and the kid by now has dug himself a hole and says, "No, I'm not doing that." So I get a bed sheet charge. There are 2 charges: failure to obey an order of a non-commissioned officer, failure to obey the order of a commissioned officer, and there's a list of specifications. And I finally convinced people to say, give me 1 NCO refusal and 1 commissioned officer refusal. The rest of it is just a waste of time and paper. And I can get the kid 6 months and 6 months, 6 months in jail and 6 months loss of pay. Okay, so you don't need to write this bed sheet. And by the way, he was AWOL because he went to the bathroom on his way to see the first sergeant. Yeah, it's dumb. You know, it's just a waste of time. So I cut a lot of things back. One case, I investigated an assault, simple assault, fight in a mess hall, clear, that kid started it and beat up the other kid. And there was no doubt he's the guilty perpetrator. So I try him for simple assault, and he's found guilty, and that's fine, and he gets 3 and 3, 3 months and 3 months, because that's what the max sentence was. Everybody, by the way, got the max sentence at court, and then the brigade commander could lessen anything if he chose to. And this kid got 3 and 3, and then after it was all over, then the mess sergeant says to me, "Yeah, and that other kid spent several days in the hospital with a broken jaw." Nobody ever told me that he had a broken jaw. That makes it felonious assault, and I would have got the kid 6 and 6. Come on, guys. Yeah, when I ask you about this, talk to me. So it was an interesting job. One of the problems with that job was one of the battalion commanders was the president of the court. So there are 7 officers. He's the one who's in charge, and he acts at that time under the UCMJ. He's the president, he's the head, he's the judge, and he's also the head of the jury of this court of lesser officers. He was an absolute, ain't no doubt, far down south racist. And anytime some black soldier came in, he was guilty when he walked in the door. And after I'd done this job for several months, and I'd learned everything I was going to learn, and I'd done all the good, and I was ready to get rid of this. I finally said to somebody who worked at brigade headquarters who had some influence, the next time we get a black kid in as a defendant, I'm going to try to remove the president of the court for cause as a racist, and that probably won't work because he'll make sure that those other guys don't vote against him for that, and then I'll just summarily remove him because I can do that to 2 jurors. And that worked absolutely well. I told that to the right person, and the next day I went off being the trial counsel, and somebody else got stuck with it. So that was Georgia, and that was basic training. Basic training was interesting.
And what was the community itself like? You said it was a nice town to live in. I mean,
yes.
In what ways were you aware of racial issues or things there, or was it all under wraps? Or
I'll skip to my next job to tell you part of how I was aware of that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it was clearly segregated. It was still down south. It was still the blacks were lesser people, and they couldn't do things in all kinds of ways. One of the pictures I remember, I have a picture in my mind of a Gulf gas station, and the white building, and the side of the building over here had 2 drinking fountains, white and colored, and had 3 bathrooms, men, women, and colored. That was Georgia in 1968. Augusta is a nice city. It was very, very nice, very historic, pretty, nice places to go out and eat. We had a good time living there, even though a lot of our life was centered on Post. And
Okay. All right. So now back to your main story.
third job, finally said, okay, I've beaten this basic training thing about as long as I can. And I finally found a job in my branch. I found a transportation corps job at Services Directorate. Services Directorate run by a colonel. That was my third colonel command. And I became the operations officer of the Center Consolidated Motor Pool. We had 2,600 vehicles, 7 physical motor pool lots, and I was the operations officer. Sergeant First Class Coffey was my NCOIC. He was wonderful. Larry Shields was he was the deputy motor officer, and he was really my boss. And Hiram Lord was the civilian who was the motor officer. Both great guys, good guys. Finally, I found a mentor, somebody I could look up to and respect and say, I want to be like Larry Shields. Interesting job. I mean, we had everything from 400 Jeeps at the MP AIT to 56 passenger buses to take basic trainees out to the rifle ranges, to 7 tanks out at the Airborne Infantry AIT, to pickup trucks and all kinds of stuff. I was the only lieutenant on Fort Gordon who had a military driver's license and was allowed to drive military vehicles. I had my own brand new Chevy pickup truck that was mine, nice vehicle. And one of the things that I did as part of my duty, the commanding general had a Jeep that was all pretty and painted and spiffy and clean and wonderful. But the commanding general was very much a dress uniform, office kind of guy, and rarely got in his Jeep to go to anywhere if he could help it. So every month I went out and drove his Jeep just to make sure it still ran and to make the tires go around. And so that was, and I did that at night when nobody would know, and it was fun.
Okay. Now, did you have a military driver's license because you were transportation? Okay.
And the operations officer of the Center Consolidated Motor Pool. Other than that, commissioned officers didn't drive military vehicles. You had a driver.
Okay.
So when I was a Class A agent back in the basic training company, on the first morning of the month, we'd go in at 4 o'clock in the morning and get a paper bag full of cash to pay the basic trainees. And it was my PFC driver and me in a Jeep. I'm wearing a 45, he's carrying an M16, and I have, no kidding, a grocery bag with $25,000 or $28,000 in cash to pay basic trainees. There was nothing like, you didn't need to put up a sign that says, money! Everybody knew what you were doing. So.
But you were staying on the base.
You stayed on the base, and I had this armed and dangerous 19-year-old driver, and that was an interesting job that came up once a month. But as the operations officer of the Center Consolidated Motor Pool, we were busy, we were important, and I learned all kinds of neat things from that, and from Sergeant Coffey, and from Captain Shields, Larry Shields, and once again, the extra duties came to be part of the really interesting what you learn from. And I became a mortuary officer. There were 4 of us: Larry Shields, my boss, and Gary Ash, who was the head mortuary officer, and Henry Gossett, who was my next door neighbor, and me. And you had mortuary officer duty from midnight Thursday to midnight Thursday. Any soldier who was killed in our geographical area, we dealt with that. Our geographical area was this eastern part of Georgia, a piece of western South Carolina, and the very western part of North Carolina. And soldiers killed in car crashes, suicides, drug overdoses, all kinds of stuff, and we dealt with it. Get the body embalmed and get a casket, get it transported to the airlines, out to Bushfield and Augusta. Delta Airlines would fly it to wherever it needed to go. We arrange for that too, and then it would be off to home to be buried. Fascinating job, really interesting. I was a contracting officer, so I got to contract with the funeral home for the embalming and the casket and the other services like transporting it out to the airport.
So how long did you do that?
For about 4 months.
And how many cases did you have to handle?
Way too many. And that goes back to the racism part. One of the interesting things was when we got a body, we'd call the funeral home. One of the nice things was Larry Shields, my boss, was also a mortuary officer. So if I called him some morning and said, "Sir, this is John, I have a body," he knew what that meant. And I could be gone from my job for a couple of days, and he'd cover for me. He understood that. At the basic training company, when I had a case to work for the court, my boss didn't understand that. And why aren't you here being a training officer and taking care of what I need? Because I got this other thing that is more important right now. So as the mortuary officer, it was nice to have Larry Shields to call and say, "I got a body," and I wouldn't have to say anything else. He knew what that meant. When I called the funeral home, I had 3 funeral homes for white guys, and I would call all 3 of them and say, "Here are the circumstances, give me a bid," and they would each give me a bid, and then I would accept the lowest bid, and that funeral home would handle it. If it was a black guy, I had 1 funeral home because funeral homes were very segregated, and I would call them and say, "Here it is, here's the situation, give me a bid," and then I'd wait a half an hour and call them back and tell them they had the body because there was nobody else. They were the only black funeral home. So, suicides, guy getting divorced, his friend helping him move. They get all the stuff out in the guy's truck, and the guy getting divorced says, "Wait a minute," and goes back inside his house, and the guy, his friend says, "I thought I heard a door slam," and the guy didn't come out, and he went in and found he'd shot himself. Worst case we had that was just horrific, brand new trainees in the basic training unit. I mean, like they've been in the Army 2 days and come in, a lot of these kids never been out of the county they were born in, never seen a 3-story building from wherever, and they're in the Army 2 or 3 days, and Sunday afternoon say to their E5 drill sergeant wannabe, a kid who's just back from Vietnam and learning how to be a drill sergeant, "Can we go to the PX and buy razor blades and Coke and stuff, toothpaste?" And he said, "Sure." And so like a good young drill sergeant, he forms them up in a platoon and he marches them off to the PX and says, "You got an hour, have a Coke, do whatever you need, and I'll meet you right back here, don't be late." And so they come back, and by the time they come back, it's now dark. And he forms them up in a platoon, all wearing their nice dark green fatigues, and marches them back to the basic training area, and a drunk first sergeant drives into the back of the platoon. 2 of the kids got killed instantly, another one died 2 days later. This went to the Pentagon as flash traffic. Gary Ash, the head mortuary officer, was the one on duty, and he called all 3 of us and said, "Y'all come." And Sunday night, all 4 of us are over at the mortuary office dealing with this because of the, all of the aspects, and this is going to be in the newspaper. And by the way, the chief of staff with a post came down to visit us that Sunday night, and don't mess this one up, guys. So there was a lot of pressure with this, and then the other guy died a couple of days later, so that changed the dynamics of it, and that was just horrid. And how do you take, I literally, instead of shipping that one back to South Carolina, one of those kids who was killed right away, I got in the hearse with a soldier driving an Army hearse, and we drove it back to Columbia, South Carolina, instead of flying it back the next day. So being a mortuary officer was a really, really interesting extra duty. Like being a trial counsel, I considered going to law school and then said, no, I really don't want to do that. And I considered becoming a mortician, and I said, no, I understand, I accept death is a fact of life, but I don't need to be part of that. So fascinating job.
All right. So now when does your stint at Fort Gordon end?
I went on active duty on the 1st of February, so it should have been on the 1st of February in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
However, that thing from before of, oh, you failed those physicals and we got to fix that, well, that happened in November of 1969. So go in the hospital and get operated on, and that was more difficult than it needed to be, and spent a week in the hospital, and then came out, and I could have been on convalescent leave for all the rest of the time I was on active duty, but I'm much too much of a Class A guy to do that, so now I was back to work in a couple of weeks and working fewer hours and some of that, but it was okay. And I had applied to Western Michigan University to work on my doctorate. And the Army regulation said, if you're going back to college, then you can get released up to 3 months early, I think, 2 days before the final day of registration for going back to college. So I was going to go back to work on my doctorate starting at the beginning of January 1970. So that backed up 2 or 3 days, and then it backed up some more because of the holiday, and then it backed up 2 or 3 travel days, and then it backed up a couple more because of Christmas, and I got released in time to get home on Christmas Eve, which was, okay, that worked out. I was home for Christmas in 1969, and it's the first time I'd been back to Michigan since I left in February the year before.
All right. Now, at this point, are you still in the reserves, or what is the setup?
The week, I literally got home on Christmas Eve, home back to Detroit to my mom and dad's house, and then came over to Kalamazoo, and my wife and I stayed with friends, and we're in the process of buying a house in Portage, so I could start working on my doctorate that week. And it was interesting. Between Christmas and New Year's was the only time in the 28 years I was in the Army that I was not in a paid slot. I actually took that week off. that was nice. And then that first week of January, I went to the 415th Civil Affairs Company in Kalamazoo, which was 5 miles from my house, and joined the 415th.
Okay.
So, and I did that because I needed the money. I was working my doctorate. I had a graduate assistantship that I was working 20 hours a week and got paid $1,500. Mm-hmm. I was on the GI Bill. My wife was very pregnant, and we had a 10-month-old son. So, and we bought a house. Other than that, you know, we're having a good time. Because we're young. Who knows better?
Okay. So you basically joined the reserves. That's your choice.
Yep.
You didn't have to be.
When you come off active duty, your commitment at the end of ROTC is 6 years. Mm-hmm. And that could be 2 years of active duty and 4 years of reserve or National Guard time. It could be 6 years of reserve or National Guard time. It could be, it depends. Mm-hmm. Since I was one of the good guys coming out of ROTC, I was put on active duty. That mm-hmm. was, I didn't have to choose that. That's what I would have chosen, right. But I went on 2 years. Then I would have been required to be in, at least on the list, to be in a reserve or National Guard unit for 4 years. I chose to go because I wanted the job for the money.
Okay. Now, describe the unit you joined.
Well, one of the things I did wrong, and it goes back to the not having mentors thing from the get-go, my strange Army career, that lieutenants are platoon leaders and then they become captains and company commanders, and if they're really good, lieutenant colonels and battalion commanders. I never did any of that because I was in that weird CA unit, mm-hmm. then that basic training unit, and then that neat job as an operations officer at a motor pool. And then I got into the 415th Civil Affairs Company. In the 26 years that I was in the reserve, I was never not in a paid slot. I was always in some unit where I was getting paid for going to drill and annual training and all of that. The problem was nobody told me stay in a reserve unit 3 years and then get out because it'll develop your career better to be moving into other units and learning more and progressing up. I stayed in the 415th Civil Affairs Company for 9 years, went to the next unit for about 9 years, and then went to the next unit for about the same. So there was my 26 years in just 3 units. But it was a great career. I kept getting promoted and kept getting better jobs and kept doing good things for the Army, and the Army kept saying, yeah, you can stay. So in the 415th was kind of like that 95th Civil Affairs Group back at the beginning of active duty. They didn't have much to do. They had some more to do, and it was a little more interesting, and we were focused on Europe. My concept was we're still focused fighting World War II in Europe. We really ought to get that updated some, but there was enough to do to make it worth staying there, and I got promoted to captain after a couple of years and I changed jobs and got a better job and became an assistant operations officer and all of that. And at the end of 9 years, we went some interesting places too. It's a civil affairs unit. One summer we went to the Upper Peninsula and worked with an Indian tribe. Good, that's civil affairs work. That's the kind of thing we do. We flew out to Fort Carson, Colorado once and did some interesting CA stuff out there and got to fly out on Air Force airplanes. So I got to be the Army component commander on an airplane flying to Colorado, which was really kind of fun. That was neat. So we went some interesting places, and we went to Camp Grayling, and we went to Fort McCoy. And
so what do civil affairs people actually do?
the intersection between the military and civilians. And one of the problems with war is civilians get in the way. One of the things we've learned eventually from some really bad experiences especially is you really need to deal with the civilians and get them out of the way and help them when they're in your control, in your area. So civil affairs unit, I can give you a real easy civil affairs project. A village, okay, civil affairs people will go to the Army Engineer Unit and say, let's go to this village and dig a well, because these people need that. And you guys have that capability, and let's go do that. And they would arrange with the military unit to go and help win the hearts and minds by doing something like digging a well, building a school, doing some infrastructure work to try to help those civilians have a better life and learn to love the United States and democracy and all of that. So it was that kind of thing. Out of World War II, it was civil affairs, military government, where the idea, especially in Germany, was go in and take over, run the city government, which was another whole interesting concept. But so we were focused on Europe. It was the beginning of why I became a Cold War soldier, and I stayed there way too long. At the end of about 8 or 9 years, I was a captain, a senior captain, and getting promoted to major within 6 or 12 months. One of the problems of being in the Army Reserve as opposed to active duty is when you get promoted, you have to go find your own job. In active duty, when you get promoted to major, the Army says you're now major and you're going to fill that slot. In the reserves, you got to go find that slot. And one of my instructors, who I was taking classes from Command and General Staff College, had been in the 415th and was at the 4160th USARF school, United States Army Reserve Forces school. And he said, come on down, join us. So I did. And I was put into a major slot teaching officer advanced course, got an early promotion to major because I was in that major slot and I was doing a wonderful job. I'm a teacher, that's what I know how to do. And then did that for a year and then became a Command and General Staff College teacher because by then I had graduated from CNGS on the Commandant's list. And so I taught Command and General Staff College.
Okay. So where are you doing those things?
Well, the 415th was 5 miles from my house,
right,
over by the airport in Kalamazoo. You got to go find your slot, Well, the 4160th was in Kingsbury, Indiana, 100 miles from my house. So on Saturday morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, Ted Barnum and I would get up and drive down to Kingsbury and drill all day, stay Saturday night, drill all day Sunday, and drive back Sunday night on the times that we went to Kingsbury. But he and I were both CNGS instructors. So we might have been teaching in Fort Wayne or in Kingsbury or in Kalamazoo or Fort Custer or wherever our class happened to be meeting that year or that time. So the 100 miles was to the unit. But until I became the director of officer courses, I didn't always go to the unit. I was going to wherever I taught. And so as a CNGS instructor, I love teaching CNGS. Geez, that was fun to do. And once again, Cold War, protecting Germany from the Russian invasion, and taught CNGS for several years, and then became the director of officer courses. So instead of being the teacher, I was the principal, and then became the assistant commandant, so then it's like assistant superintendent. And the CNGS thing was really interesting because it's 6 phases for the students, and the odd-numbered phases, 1, 3, and 5, you do during the regular school year from September to May. 1 weekend a month somewhere, and that's what I taught. During the summer, you did the even phases, 2, 4, and 6, and that was 2 weeks of active duty wherever it was being held. So I got to go teach during the summer, and I was really good, and people knew I was really good. And so I didn't teach 2 weeks. Several summers I would get done teaching elementary school on a Friday, Saturday leave for the Army, and someday in late August or early September come back and go back to school the next day.
So where would they send you to do the teaching for those?
Rickenbacker Air National Guard Base south of Columbus, Ohio, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, New Orleans, Louisiana, we stayed at the University of New Orleans, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. That may be the whole list. Okay. Fort Harrison, Indiana. All kinds of interesting places. And I would go for the big tour. I'd go for at least a month, 17 days, teach at New Orleans for a month, and then leave a weekend and go to Fort Sill and teach for the rest of the summer and go back home.
So this is sort of the middle part of your reserve career then, essentially, when you're doing this kind of teaching and training work. When you're off all summer, what does your family do?
Lots of times come to see me, come to be with me. And they did that whichever unit I was in. So when my sons were 5 and 6 probably, they spent a summer at Camp Grayling because I was running a center up there for 2 months, and I had a house trailer that was mine, and so plenty of room for wife and kids, and the kids, I'd go off to work in the morning and they'd go down to Lake Margaret and play up in northern Michigan for the summer, and they came to Fort Sill to see me, and they've been some interesting places to come and spend time. It was fun. I missed driver ed for both of my sons, which I still regret. But my wife did a great job of raising our sons in the summer. So.
Okay. All right. So in all of this time now, you're during the school year, you're an elementary school teacher.
Yep. Or middle school eventually. That
Okay.
was a mistake I made.
All right. Okay. So now, what's the next stage?
Well, CNGS, I was a teacher, then the director of officer courses and assistant commandant. Towards the end of that, I spent 2 summers in a row as the quality control officer at Rickenbacker Air National Guard Base, where the Ohio school was running CNGS, and I was the one who hired all of the faculty, told them what they were going to teach, watched them rehearse their teaching, watched them teach, and then wrote their officer efficiency report. Most lieutenant colonels write somewhere between 5 and 10 OERs a year, because that's how many officers they have working for them. I wrote 180 OERs in 4 months. Those 2 summers, it was brutal. I worked 16 hours a day every day, which was interesting, and did that for 2 months. Got invited back the second year because the neat thing was I got to create the job. It was their first year, and they said, let's hire somebody, and they hired me because they had heard of me, and I was a very senior lieutenant colonel, so I outranked almost every one of my instructors, and they knew I was good, and I really did an impressive job, so I got to come back and do it again. And at the end of the second summer, they said, come back next year, and I said, ain't happening. No,
Okay.
no thank you.
Now, what's an Army guy doing on an Air National Guard base?
That's where the school was conducting its class. That was where it was happening. So it was the Ohio Reserve School that was based in Columbus, and Rickenbacker is just south of Columbus, Ohio, and so it was a good place for them. And they had the room and the space and the classrooms and the dormitory, the living quarters, and so it worked. That's where the Army decided to put it, and the National Guard said, sure, we'd love to have you here, and
Okay.
so that's where we were.
So you're still doing Army work at that point, even though it's
Oh, yeah.
an air base?
Oh, yeah. That was the Army Command and General Staff College.
Okay.
It was really hard and really enlightening, really fun. Just absolutely interesting one-time opening meeting, telling the faculty the opening, here's the beginning, here's what you need to do, and the standard I expect. And some guy about 5 rows back raises his hand and told me the punchline of a joke that I had used at Fort Sill, Oklahoma 3 years before, because he was one of my students. and it was just, it's a small Army, you know, it keeps coming back to you. So at the end of that, I'd been in that unit way too long, just like I'd been in the 415th too long, and I was the assistant commandant, and it was time to go somewhere else. There was an Army unit at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, that was, while everybody else was reducing size of Army units, that unit was growing because they were created to do something different and strange and special. And so it was the 1st Brigade of the 85th Division, and so I got hired to be their G5, which is their Civil Affairs Staff Officer. The unit was designed to conduct exercises for large Army units, division, corps, these huge Army units, and we would run a paper exercise, a war in a weekend or 5 days, and really, really interesting. It just, like the Civil Affairs unit and the school that I was in, this unit was also very unusual, very high rank. Most brigades would be commanded by a colonel and have about 5 or 6 lieutenant colonels. Our brigade was commanded by a brigadier general. We had 18 full colonels and 82 lieutenant colonels, and I was the senior lieutenant colonel. And so I was the G5 there for a couple of years, and eventually became the G1, which is the personnel officer. And that's what led me to my next job after I retired from the Army. But I stayed there about 8 years. It was
What's the
really
time frame for that?
At the late 80s to 1995.
Okay.
Like 87 probably to 1995.
All right.
And then right at the end, I gave up the G1 job because there was somebody to take it, and I was a scenario development director for 3 months to fill in until I retired. And I retired in March '95 after all of that time in the Army. And I retired because I was TDO, too darn old, and never going to get promoted to colonel because never had those jobs like platoon leader and company commander and all of that stuff. I'd done all these weird, strange things. Had a lot of fun, done a lot of good for the Army, and really enjoyed almost all of it. But it was not going to get me to be a full colonel at the end.
Right. So you would have been with the Fort Sheridan assignment when the Gulf War happened.
Yes.
were there any ripple effects that got to you, or what were you doing at that point?
I volunteered to go to the Gulf War and got told they needed E5s more than O5s. So thank you, Colonel, but we don't need you. A couple of our guys did get to go, which was kind of interesting because then we had folks in the dirt and get some interesting satellite phone calls from them, which was kind of unusual. So that was a tangential effect to what we were doing and what our focus was.
Now, did the 415th wind up going, say, to former Yugoslavia or later to Iraq or anywhere like that?
Finally, by that time, what they had figured out was send some. They had made those. The 415th was a civil affairs company commanded by a lieutenant colonel, which is really weird. Companies are commanded by captains. Mm-hmm. So the Army finally went, duh, we got to make those battalions, even though they're this little unit, because they're commanded by a lieutenant colonel, which they have to be. So what they finally figured out was send some civil affairs battalion, but fill it with people from a whole bunch of other civil affairs battalions. So the one from Green Bay, Wisconsin may go off to Iraq or somewhere, but they would take a bunch of people, their people, but then a lot of other people. So some of the people from the 415th got to go with other things like that.
Mm-hmm. But by the time all that was going on, you had moved on to
I was long gone.
This other unit that was doing very different kind of work that would not normally probably get you sent.
Right. We
were
absolutely a TDA, not a TOE. We were a table of distribution and allowances. We were teaching in the school and then teaching again in the 85th Division. Just different, really strange. So I got to go some neat places with them too. I got sent to Fort Irwin, California for the first time, been there 3 times, which was fascinating because of what goes on there and using that to help how we taught large units and evaluated what people did. And
what sort of place is Fort Irwin, just sort of geographically?
Fort Irwin is it is actually about 53 miles past Nowhere, California. You go to Barstow, which is just, in my opinion, it's a crossroads. It's a railroad crossroads, and it's where I-15 and I-40 meet, and it's, geez, I'm glad I don't live there. It's just nowhere, and you get there and you drive 53 miles on a 2-lane road through the desert, and you come to the front gate of Fort Irwin, and when you get past through the front gate, then you drive another 3 miles to the cantonment area, and the war fighting goes on 20 miles farther out. It's way out in the Mojave Desert. It's an interesting, fascinating place to go watch the training, but been there 3 times.
Okay. Now you're in the Army, for this period now, better part of 3 decades. Now, and it's an era when the military went through a lot of changes. You had the effects of Vietnam, and then a downsizing from that, and then at various stages, more rebuilding and back and forth. How much of that kind of ebb and flow did you notice, either in terms of personnel or morale or whatever?
The 415th, the first civil affairs unit, the first reserve unit I got into, got a lot of that effect of the end of Vietnam. And they had a lot of soldiers who had joined the reserves to avoid going to Vietnam because they were going to be drafted or afraid they were going to be. So getting in the National Guard or reserves kept you from going to Vietnam because Lyndon Johnson refused to send reservists and National Guardsmen, which was only one of the many mistakes he made. And so we had people hiding in the 415th who were only there because it was avoiding Vietnam. They weren't particularly interested in staying any longer than they had to or being a good soldier. And then the end of the Vietnam time, the 70s, it was difficult. It was, we got rid of a lot of those people who were Vietnam avoiders. That helped. And then we were having all kinds of other interesting problems of haircuts and drugs, and just like the active Army was. So that was a struggle. Then the Reagan buildup was the great time to be in the Army, because we saw a lot of effect of that. And there was money to do training. You could actually go somewhere and get done and go to school and do all kinds of neat things. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I can recall the late 70s, certainly when I was college age, or whatever. The Army was absolutely the last thing most people would do, at least if they had any other kind of option.
Yep.
And the military it was all volunteer at that point, but they
Yep.
were having problems getting good quality recruits.
Yep.
So all of that stuff was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But then once it gets some more prestige attached to it, more resources put in,
Then
the
it
Reagan
got,
era,
then
then
it got
you do better.
The reserve was a better place to be than active duty.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the local things like Kalamazoo. We got college kids, and we got guys who had been in Vietnam and came back and joined the reserves because Vietnam was over and they knew they weren't going to do that again, and they needed the job, or they saw the future of being able to retire from the Army or something. So it was a better place to be than on active duty, but it was still, we got some of the struggle of some of the issues that were going on.
Mm-hmm. In any of these situations, I mean, did you notice any issues with race, or was that after Georgia, was that not really something that came up?
Not something that came up with us in Kalamazoo or in Indiana or in Illinois. Especially by the time I got to the 85th Division, everything was fine. It was well integrated. It didn't matter what color you were. It mattered if you could do your job.
Yeah, and you were at the level of officers and career people and so forth, and you had a lot more in common at that point anyway.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Now you leave the reserves now, but then you say you go on to your next job.
Because I was the G1 at the 85th, that was my last real important major job in the Army. Personnel officer, one of the things I did was I dealt with the Red Cross messages that came when somebody had a family emergency. Mm-hmm. And I saw that and saw the effect of that and how good and important that was. So when I retired from the Army in 1995, I went to the Kalamazoo chapter of the American Red Cross and said, I've seen this, I've seen how it works, I want to be part of it. And I was for 20 years. Was a volunteer for 3 years. And then as service to the armed forces, the Red Cross does several things like blood. I know not much about that. Disaster, I know way too much about that. That was my second job in the Red Cross as a volunteer especially, though once a difference of that. But my main job, my main focus was service to the armed forces. And I did that as a volunteer in Kalamazoo for 3 years. And somebody at the Red Cross in Kalamazoo made a horrible mistake. They called me one day and said, John, the Red Cross has created this thing called Service to the Armed Forces Reservists. You might be interested in this. And they lost their best SAF volunteer because I went off to national headquarters as an employee. I was an intermittent employee. I worked full-time part of the time. Mm-hmm. And when I wasn't working full-time, I was a volunteer at the Kalamazoo chapter or somewhere. And I said, when I started this job, send me places that the Army didn't in 28 years. And so I've been stationed at Navy bases, Marine bases, Air Force bases, Army posts that I'd never been to before, and even did one day with the Coast Guard on Kodiak Island. And it was my birthday to make it even better. So I lived a year in Japan. I lived in Alaska for 6 months in the winter. I've been all over the United States, the continental United States. Lived in England for 5 months, Germany for a year, and Italy for a year. Okay. And it was just wonderful, fascinating, fun, interesting.
Okay. So when were you in Japan?
I've been to Japan 9 times.
Okay.
The first time I went with the Army. The Army sent me to Japan and Korea. The second time I went with school, where I was teaching. We had an exchange program. Okay. And then I finally got sent with the Red Cross, and I was at Iwakuni Marine Corps Air Station for 6 months. And then by this time, my wife had also become a Red Cross station manager, Red Service to the Armed Forces station manager. And so when she was at Yokosuka, I got to stay with her for 6 months. And I've been all over Japan. We have friends in Japan. I love Japan. I'd go back tomorrow, except for the 12-hour flight. It's not fun. The Red Cross, when my wife was doing this job too, the Red Cross line was, hey, you're in the same country. And the first time they told us that, I was running a station in Alaska and she was running one in North Carolina. That's the same country, 5 time zones apart.
Yeah.
We've been in the same country in Italy, in the same country in Germany, in the same country in Japan. So, and then we go see each other. And I was at Nellis Air Force Base, which is Las Vegas, and got sent to Fort Irwin. Got the phone call from the guy who sends me places and said, John, we need you to go to Fort Irwin. I said, Roger, I've been to Fort Irwin. I don't want to go back. And he said, John, you didn't hear the first paragraph. We need you to go to Fort Irwin. And I said, of course, fine. But who's going to take over here? And he said, don't know, haven't figured that out. So when I told my wife, she said, I'll apply. I'll do it. So she got hired. And on February 18th that year, I was the station manager at Nellis. And on February 19th, she was. I remember it was February 18th because that's my birthday. And that afternoon, the chapter in Las Vegas gave me a surprise going away birthday party. And the next day, my wife took over, and I went 191 miles to Fort Irwin. And then every weekend, we'd meet somewhere like Death Valley or 29 Palms or Joshua Tree or Nellis or Fort Irwin or Barstow, somewhere. It was fun.
All right. You mentioned, so you have your principal assignment, but you were involved with disaster relief?
Service to the armed forces was what I did for the Red Cross. That was my paid slot. When we came home, we're in between those paid trips, those 6-month trips. Then you're, what are you going to do for the Red Cross now? And it was difficult to do service to the armed forces work in Kalamazoo because there's labor law that says you can't be paid to do what you're a volunteer, or you can't volunteer to do what you're paid for. It's a conflict, so we really shouldn't do SAF work, so don't tell anybody that we actually did that. But, so we did disaster work instead. So we did a lot of local disasters, and then I've been to hurricanes in Kokomo and Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy. It's a blinking hurricane as far as I'm concerned. And when I was stationed at Sigonella Naval Air Station on Sicily, we had a flood. And I became the national director for that national disaster, that flood at Sigonella, which was the hardest, best time I ever spent working for the Red Cross. It was an unbelievably difficult about 3 or 4 weeks, right at leading up to Christmas. And geez, did we do a lot of people a lot of good. It was just rewarding. It was just marvelous. But so it was a disaster assignment in the middle of an SAF assignment, which really confused some people at national headquarters. I called my boss, who was up at Vicenza, Italy, and my wife was stationed there too, and called my boss and said we had this flood, 1,536 people flooded out of their quarters, and here's what's going on. And so she called national headquarters, and Roger, that guy who we work for, who sends us on assignments, walked down the hall to the disaster services people and said, what's this thing John's got going on in Sigonella? And so I forced them to actually get together and talk to each other, which was neat, because I was going to spend Red Cross money to do this. So that was amazing. But the Red Cross assignments were just so wonderful, worthwhile, important, what the Red Cross SAF does. But when I started in 1999, my first assignment was to national headquarters. I went to national headquarters. I've been assigned to Washington, D.C. 4 times, all 4 with the Red Cross, never with the Army. I went to D.C. national headquarters for 3 months to work in the call center and learn how to really do casework. And then I got sent to stations. And my first one was Fort Polk, Louisiana, and I went there for 5 weeks. Went home for 3 weeks, got sent to Fort Hood, Texas for 7 weeks, got sent home, and the 9/11 attacks happened. And the 5 and 7 week jobs became 6-month jobs, because the Red Cross was deploying station managers to the war, and we went and filled in where they were coming from. So I spent 6 months in Alaska in the winter, loved it, absolutely loved it. You run out of words for beautiful. And there were 3 things about a Red Cross. People would say, how was your assignment in wherever? And I'd say, well, there are 3 things. Billeting, where you lived, the job itself, and the volunteers, okay? And like Alaska, the volunteers were marvelous. The job itself was wonderful, casework and things. And the quarters were, the roof didn't leak, you know, it was okay. And I had a way to cook, so it was all right. My wife, my last year, my last assignment, I was at Roger. By this time, Roger knew my wife and I were some of the really good people he had to call on. And he called me one week and said, John, next week I'm going to call you and I'm going to offer you one of 5 places. So let me tell you what those are so you can think about it. So next week, you know, you can tell me which one you want. And he told me the 5 places, and I said, Aviano Air Base, Italy. And he said, no, you can't tell me that till next week. I can't offer it to you. So next week he called and I said, Aviano Air Base, Italy. Well, my wife had an assignment at the same time. We did countries that start with I. I was at Aviano Air Base, Italy. She was in Tikrit, Iraq. And everybody looks at me and says, oh boy, did you get the better choice, the better assignment? And no way. She had that great assignment in Iraq. All she did was casework, emergency messages, dealing with soldiers and Marines and doing casework and doing casework and doing casework 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for 144 days. It was a wonderful job. I had a bunch of volunteers who were really a pain in the neck. And the Air Force, I love the Air Force and I love Air Force assignments. They threw a couple of things in that made it really not that much fun. So she had a much better assignment in Iraq than I did. She sent me a message one day that said, I set a personal record. I did 22 emergency messages today. And I sent her back an answer that said, well, I did 22 emergency messages in January. That was the way the caseload was. She did messages. That's why she was there. So the Red Cross assignments were just rewarding, heartwarming, because you're working with young troops and doing things that affect their lives. Fort Irwin one time on deployment at Fort Irwin, and at Fort Irwin you go, we were in what's called the Dust Bowl for good cause, and you walk over and go through the chow line, get your breakfast, come back and stand up at a table that's chest high and eat. And I eat with the kids. That's what I'm there. Hi, I'm John. I'm the Red Cross guy. Who are you? And one night I had dinner and this young soldier's across from me and I said to her, I'm John, the Red Cross guy. Who are you? And she tells me her name and I said, where are you from? That's always my next question. She said, Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I said, I'm from Portage. And so we have this neat talk about Grand Rapids and Michigan and how much we love West Michigan and all of that. The next morning I got an emergency message. I'm sorry, her grandmother died. And I get to go deliver that. But she knew me. That helped. That really did help. But it was that kind of work, that kind of important, personal, real stuff.
Yeah, and it's sort of unambiguously good things to do for other people.
It just one of the reasons I love being on Air Force bases is the first week I go find the first sergeants. They have a meeting every week, and Air Force first sergeants have the same job description I do: take care of the kids. That's what we do. So I go meet with them the first week and say, this is the face that goes with the voice that you're going to hear on the phone when I deliver messages to you, and then work with them really, really closely. That was when that flood happened at Sigonella, the base commander, the first emergency center meeting we had when that flood happened, said, our purpose now is to take care of the people. That's the whole focus. Flying the planes, fixing the stuff, all that, we take care of the people. That's our first focus. And my thought was, he just gave all these people my job description. Take care of the kids. That's what we do. And that's why it was so rewarding. Just a wonderful job. Even when you had lousy quarters and difficult volunteers and whatever, you still had the casework. And that was fun. And then you get to go places, like living in London, England was really interesting. I love London. It's a neat city. So the Air Force gig that came right out of the Army thing, it was really, really heartwarming. At the end of it, I went back to being a volunteer, and instead of being a station manager running around places, I was an instructor teaching casework for national headquarters. And so I got sent to Sacramento and Texas and Virginia and Washington, D.C., and all kinds of interesting places to teach the 3-day casework class. So that was fun to do too. That was because you're teaching people how to do this casework system that helps all these service members when they have some difficulty. The best one I ever had, Red Cross people either love or hate hospital assignments. I got assigned to Portsmouth Naval Medical Center, and it was one of those emergency calls. Usually Roger would call, like he said, and said, I'm going to give you 5 choices. That was for an assignment next month. You had a month to get ready to go, and you could say, yes, I can do that. Every once in a while, he would call and say, hi, John, can you go to Korea tomorrow? Something happened, somebody got hurt, somebody quit, whatever. Portsmouth Naval Medical Center was one of those. Somebody quit. And it was, can you go to Portsmouth tomorrow? And the other half, what you'll learn quickly, is you're going tomorrow, but there is no end because they don't know who's going to fill the job. So you're there till they tell you to go somewhere else. And I got can you go to Portsmouth? And I said, sure, I'd love to do that. So I went, huge medical center, serving 150,000 active duty people from all the services in this piece of Virginia of Fort Lee and the Air Force Base over here and the Army Post and the Naval Air Station and all of these people. Well, 150,000 active duty people, we had 200 to 300 babies a month. The best emergency messages to send. Your wife had a baby. One of the neat things the Navy does that I used to love, I'd send those to ships wherever, and I can send messages to submarines, figure that out. But send those messages off to ships wherever. When the ships came back after their 6 months of being gone, the first guys who get off the ship are the dads of the newborns. They have their Red Cross message, and that's their pass to get off the ship first. And waiting at the bottom of the ladder is their wife and baby and other kids if appropriate. And I used to be there to watch that happen because I got to send those messages. Geez, that was fun.
Okay. And of course, in the last part of your volunteer time, those last few years, now that's overlapping with the active operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now we're taking casualties over there and that kind of thing. Did you deal with any of that side of things?
All of that is the military's responsibility. If your favorite soldier or Marine gets wounded or killed, it's up to the armed forces to notify the next of kin. Where the Red Cross gets involved is in dealing with the family. Can we help? Can we help do anything? And there's lots of things we can help do with funeral services or transportation, or we got a lot of neat volunteers who can do all kinds of interesting stuff. I got one that was just this, you've got to be kidding, God is watching. My insurance agent called and said her friend got a phone call from the Marine Corps in Washington, D.C., saying that her son was wounded in Afghanistan and that they would call back in about 3 hours with more details. And they haven't called back, and it's been 3 hours. Do you know anything about that process and how that works? And I said to my insurance agent, you just called the best person in the whole state of Michigan who can deal with this. Yeah, I can, yes, I can help with this. So I called the mother in Schoolcraft, and she said, shall I go to Germany, because he's going to be evacuated to Landstuhl. Shall I go to Germany to be there with him? And I said, no, absolutely not. Do not do that. Even if you have a passport, which thank heaven she didn't. Because what you're liable to end up doing is you'll get to Landstuhl as he's coming back to Camp Pendleton. And don't do that. wait and see what happens. And I said, okay, he's going to Landstuhl. And she said, yeah. And I said, okay, good. I know the station manager. The station manager at Landstuhl is a friend of mine. And by the way, she's from Schoolcraft. Get on my computer and send Leah an email that says, go find this kid. So she finds the Marine Corps liaison. She's got to take him with her, and goes and finds this wounded Marine at Landstuhl the next day, and walks in and says, hi, I'm Leah. I'm from Schoolcraft, Michigan. Good to meet you. You know, which just, you got to be kidding. I get wounded in Afghanistan and end up with this. That was cool. And then he was going to go to Camp Pendleton. There's a housing thing that is at military hospitals where families get to go stay. So I called and greased the skids for the mom when she got her orders from the Marine Corps to get into the Fisher House at Camp Pendleton. There were all kinds of neat things that we did from that. So stuff like that. So we get, the Red Cross can do all kinds of interesting things. And it was fun. It was rewarding. It was a great carry on from my Army career. So,
all right. I guess to look back now across the whole sweep of this story, are there other particular incidents or memories that are going to stand out for you that you've not gotten to here yet?
oh, geez.
You'll think of them later, but.
Oh yeah. Red Cross stuff. The flood in Sigonella. I could. That story is amazing, of what happened with and what we did and how much good we did and how interesting that was. And it started raining on a Sunday, and this is early December, and it rained until Wednesday morning. The river flooded and went right through the housing area, one of the two housing areas at Sigonella, and 1,536 people got flooded. Almost everybody. There were like 2 houses in this area that were 6 inches higher than the others and got no water, and one of them happened to be the engineer of the base, which got derided. Everybody, how'd you plan that? And but it happened at 4 o'clock on a Wednesday, 2, 3, 4 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. So at 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm standing in my office saying, okay, now how are we going to deal with this? I had at that office the biggest bunch of Red Cross volunteer leaders I had anywhere on any assignment. There were 11 of us altogether. I was the manager, my secretary, we were the only 2 paid people, and I had 9 volunteer leaders. When this flood happened, it was Christmas, just before Christmas. Of those 11 people, 3 of us were there. My disaster chair was flooded. My chair of volunteers was flooded. My secretary was home on Christmas leave. There was our treasurer and my station chair, my head volunteer, and me. And the deputy commander, the post deputy, the base deputy commander's wife was an old Red Cross volunteer, but not one of my active volunteers. She showed up, and she was worth about 4 people all by herself. And we did more fabulous, interesting, wonderful things for people. They were flooded, and they're out there. Went out on Thursday. They spent Wednesday night in their quarters, no electricity, no food. Downstairs is full of smelly water, and you sleep upstairs in the cold. And on Thursday, got them out. They either waded out or got out in rubber boats or whatever, put them on buses and brought them over to the base, the main part of the base where we were. And the first thing they saw when they got off the buses was the big American Red Cross disaster sign outside the bowling alley, which is where we registered them. And we brought them into the bowling alley, and I had spontaneous volunteers. My secretary was gone. I had this young sailor who was from Monroe, Michigan, and she said, I'll come in and be your secretary for, you know, while your secretary's gone, on her spare time while she's still being in the Navy. So she said, what do you need me to do? And I said, go find volunteers. She goes back to the barracks, starts knocking on doors and says, the Red Cross needs you. And all these young sailors show up and say, what do you need us to do? That kind of military. Those are the kids we're dealing with. And they came into the bowling alley. We had Red Cross shelter forms, and my volunteers were spread on every writing service they could find. And we said, we need one person from your family, go to see the volunteer and register. Everybody else go eat breakfast, because they hadn't eaten much in 2 days. And so we registered them, and that's where that count came from, because then I went back to my secretary and said, count up the people. And she said 1,536 by going through all those forms. We had a meeting that afternoon in the gym. So all these people are sitting on the bleachers, and the base commander is standing up there, and all of his staff officers line up behind him like this, along this back by this side of the wall. And the movie camera is on him, the TV camera. And I came in late. I'm never late to anything, but I was working a problem. I was solving something, so I show up late. All the other staff officers are lined up. And the base commander, the captain, is standing right there, and right there off his shoulder is the 2-star admiral who had come down that day from Naples because we had this problem. And the only place for me to stand was right next to the admiral. Okay, good. So I get there just before the meeting starts and stand right next to the admiral. Good afternoon, sir. And so the camera angle is like this on the captain, and I'm right there off his shoulder. This goes out worldwide on AFN, Armed Forces News. Every Red Cross station manager in Europe saw it and called me and said, what can I do? Which, that worked.
Yeah.
And the next day we went out, my hospital chair was gone, home on leave, and she gave me her 4-wheel drive pickup truck because I didn't have a car. And she said, would you like to use my car while I'm gone for Christmas leave? Sure. She didn't know we turned it into an emergency rescue vehicle for the Red Cross. We put big group signs on it and hauled stuff around in the mud. And so the next day we got water and food, whatever we could gather, wherever we could get it. And we went out to the place that was flooded. People were out there scraping mud and water out, and we said, lunch, and they were so appreciative because they didn't have to stop and go somewhere and find food and take that time. And then that night, when we had that meeting in the theater, I stood up and said, I'm John from the Red Cross. First of all, your mother called, call her back. And everybody laughed, and I said, no, I got 17 health and welfare messages. 17 of you called home on your cell phone and said, we're being flooded. I'll let you know more when I know more. And then your cell phone died, and your mom's worried. Call her. And everybody laughed and said, okay, and they knew who they were. And then I said, and by the way, we fed you lunch today, and that got applause. And I said, and by the way, we're feeding you dinner tonight. My high school volunteers had cooked hot dogs and stuff, and we're out in the lobby of the movie theater where we were, and people went out and got dinner. And boy, did they appreciate that. And we fed everybody for a week, which was just, and that was the deputy commander's wife organized all that with the high school kids. The chaplains let us use their kitchen. The commissary guy said, I can't donate food, but my vendors can, and got the vendors to donate a lot of stuff. What didn't get donated, the chaplains bought. I fed everybody for a week and didn't spend any money. The Red Cross loved it, And so we just did all these wonderful things. And my wife was up at Vicenza as the station manager, and our boss was there at Vicenza as the regional manager. And my wife came down after about 10 days or 2 weeks and came down for Christmas to spend Christmas with me. We walked across the street from the part of the base where I lived and had dinner at this nice little Italian restaurant over there. And as we're walking back out of the restaurant, there's a table of 8 Americans, obviously Americans, eating at this Italian restaurant. And one of the women, as we're walking by, looks at me and said, aren't you the Red Cross guy? And I said, yes. And she said, thank you. And we go outside, and my wife said, okay, now I understand. And she was right. That was the deal. We did so much wonderful work with all my volunteers. I had three of us, but people came out of the woodwork, and we had a great time working hard. Oh boy, did we work hard. Because nobody could get back into the housing area without that Red Cross slip, that housing, that shelter slip that we gave them the back copy, and that was their pass back in, because otherwise the Italians would go in and steal everything. Yeah. People were on leave. People were in the United States and Germany and all kinds of things, and they'd come back, and then they couldn't get in to look at their flooded house. So they went to the police at the gate, and the police at the gate would call me at 1 o'clock in the morning, and I'd say, send them to the Red Cross office, and I'd walk over to the Red Cross office and fill out a shelter slip, and they could go home to see how bad it was. So it was just this amazing, how do you work a disaster into a military assignment? And it got a lot of notice at national headquarters. And I have the nicest letter from the 4-star admiral at Naples that says, you were there when we needed you. Thank you. That means a lot. That's framed. That's on my wall.
All right.
It was fun.
Okay.
It was hard. I loved it.
Well, the whole thing makes for a pretty remarkable story. So thank you very much for taking the time to share it today.
Thank you. Glad I could. It was fun.